Hello, everybody, and welcome. I am so excited to be here talking with Matt Abrams. I want to make sure, Matt, I should know this. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
I'll respond to anything. My
But
family
how
says
do you?
Abrahams just because it's
Okay,
easier to spell.
Abrahams. Okay,
Yeah.
Matt Abrahams.
Yes.
Sorry.
No
Uh,
worries.
about his fabulous book, Think Faster, Talk Smarter. And Matt, I have a question for you. So, radical candor has this problem, which people hear the title, they don't read the book, and they think they use it as an excuse to act like a jerk.
Oh,
And a couple of people who I've recommended your book to have said, "Oh, I'm an introvert, and he's trying to get me to talk like an extrovert, and that's not what you're doing." So, talk to us about the book.
well, first, I'm sorry that people are misperceiving radical candor because everybody should be reading it. It's a really valuable book. So
By the way, I'm going to interrupt you. Kelly Leonard, who wrote Yes and, told me of a 2-word book title. It's not a superpower if it can't be used for evil. So it's okay.
I see. I know Kelly. Yes, and he's very wise in many ways. So Think Faster, Talk Smarter is all about helping everybody speak better in the moment. You know, introverted, extroverted, uh, experienced communicator, less experienced communicator. We're all put into circumstances where we have to speak on the spot. Somebody asks you a question, asks for feedback. You're making small talk. You make a mistake and you have to
Yeah.
fix it. Those are the circumstances that the book is really targeted towards.
Yes. And the thing that I love about this book is that it gives people really practical, tactical advice about what to do when that kind of thing is happening. So, if it's okay, Matt, what I'd love to do
Hmm.
is read you sort of a workplace dilemma that one of the Radical Candor podcast listeners wrote into us,
Hmm.
and let's talk about some of the advice in your book that would help this person. How about that?
Sure. Sounds
Okay.
great. Sounds great. Bring it
Okay.
on.
Okay, so here it is. And by the way, some people are reporting that there are some links that are spam in the so I want to acknowledge that. And Brandy is in the background making sure that people don't click on any unsafe links. So hopefully we're keeping everybody safe. All right. So Matt, you ready
I
for
am
the
ready to think faster and talk smarter. Let's see.
All right. So here's what this person says. The culture that I'm working within favors multitaskers and quick problem solvers. So the folks who are more thoughtful thinkers and doing the behind the scenes / soft skills stuff aren't always seen as leaders. It's hard to explain to them what they're doing wrong because they might be taking all of the right steps, but maybe just not moving as quickly as somebody else would. Probably for good reason, though, if the work is super detail oriented. So sometimes it seems like the feedback that you need to give ties more to how to alter the perception that you're giving off to others so that it doesn't seem like dragging feet or excuse giving, as opposed to needing to give feedback on how to do the actual work. This is the feedback that feels harder to give. It doesn't feel fair to give, but also it's hard to envision that person acting at the next level when they can't seem to push things ahead in a way that feels meaningful. And while things in the culture, while things, sorry, blah, I'm not good at reading out loud. And while the things the culture favors are a little bit of a bummer for folks who are more thoughtful thinkers, it also feels they need to work within that system that's been created. So there's more, but I want to pause here and get your thoughts on this because I imagine you get a lot of these kinds of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things to comment on, and I'm talking to the expert on giving feedback. So take that with take my thoughts in that context. But the the situation here, I think, is one, we all do better when we have diverse thinkers and diverse ways of thinking in organizations, and it's very
Yeah.
common for organizations or pockets of organization to be like what's being described, where everybody's moving very quickly, they're all contributing, everybody's jumping in. And for people who are more thoughtful, more reflective, this can be difficult. So I think there's something that has to be looked at systemically at, we as an organization, we as a group will do better when we are more inclusive of these different ways of thinking.
Yeah.
I am an extreme extrovert. I move very quickly. My wife is an extreme introvert. She is very thoughtful. Together, I think we make a great couple because we complement each other. She has taken me back from the precipice of many mistakes because of her thoughtfulness. So the point is, we want to have some balance. So I think there's some systemic
Yeah.
work to do. The other
Yeah.
piece I would say is as thinking about how to encourage these folks who sound like they're adding value. It's not that they're not adding
Yeah.
value. They're just
Yeah.
not
They're
playing
doing
the
good work.
game. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're just not playing the game. I'd encourage people to be thinking about ways that they can contribute that make them feel comfortable without them having to be disingenuous to themselves and not authentic. For
Yeah.
example, if we're in a meeting and it's fast and furious and people are contributing and jumping on, and I'm somebody who needs to be a little more thoughtful before I contribute, I can add my voice without having to add a contribution. For example, I'm a huge fan of asking clarifying questions.
Yeah.
You can ask a question and
Yes.
contribute by saying, "Hey, have we thought about cost or the implications?" Second, you can paraphrase. I think paraphrasing is one of the most essential communication skills. It does so much for us. So, in one of these meetings where there's a lot going on, I can extract a few things that I'm hearing being said, share that with the group, say, so I'm really hearing that we're crystallizing on this notion of the time frame looking like this. I added no additional information, but I did help the group focus, and in some ways that can be one of the most important things to do in that moment. So I think there's some systemic work that has to be done. I think we have to encourage those individuals to find a way to contribute that doesn't go against their way of being in terms of thinking. And I also think what I would do, if in terms of what I think the next step of the question is what does the feedback sound like? I would ask these folks to think about their experiences of what has helped them be successful in some situations where they did speak up, and what perhaps happened in situations where they didn't. So they come to see that their active participation can make a difference. So rather than you telling them you need to participate actively, you give them an opportunity to come to that conclusion themselves, so you can help them along.
Yeah, I think that something you said there is really important, and I want to double down on it. But
Mhm.
first, I want to recognize Nate Waldron, who said we need to stop calling it soft skills. These are really
Yeah.
power skills. I have
Yes.
a very complicated relationship with the word power, but let's call
Yeah.
them strong skills or because I totally agree. There's nothing soft about it.
No, I
These
agree.
these skills are what help us achieve results. So you said, one of the things that you can do in a meeting where there's a lot of stuff going on is summarize what has been said. And this is really important. So I'm a writer. So as you can imagine, I'm an introvert. And before I went to business school, I was very nervous because this seems like a kind of environment like this
Mhm.
the person who wrote in this question is describing. It was highly a lot of extroverts, and you were graded on your participation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was and so I had a mentor who told me, he said, here's the thing to do, Kim. Come in and listen very actively, like pay a lot of attention to what other people are saying. And when the class or the meeting, if you're not in if you're not in a business school class, is about a little more than halfway through, when you're about 60% in, summarize where you think people are, and that allows the conversation to pivot. And if you have a new idea,
Mhm.
add that idea in. And if you don't have a new idea, it's fine to propose a hypothesis. I think very often as an introvert, I feel like I have to be sure that what I'm saying is right before I say anything. And one of the things that was very liberating for me is to say, I don't have to only talk about my conclusions. It's also valuable to talk about hypotheses and observations. And that helped me a lot.
I think yes, absolutely. The ability to share in a concise and clear way your hypotheses, the things you're thinking about that might impact the situation, very important. And I love that idea of strategically timing when you do the paraphrasing or the summarizing.
Yeah.
Um, you said something there, Kim, that I think many of us fear. And in the book, I really talk about this. The way to get better at responding to spontaneous speaking situations is to manage your mindset, but also your
Yes.
messages. And you said something about you want to get it right before you speak. And I think a lot of us put a lot of pressure on ourselves
Yeah.
to say things the right way. And I think this actually can work against us because we're
Yes.
constantly judging and evaluating. And what I advocate for is turning that volume down a little bit. Certainly, we have to make sure that what we say is appropriate and fits. So there is some level of judging, but a lot of us are really, really putting pressure on ourselves to say it right, to do it right. And that gets in the way. I teach at Stanford's Business School, so I know the type of student you were, and I work actively to try to set an environment where those who are a little more thoughtful have a chance to contribute. And one of the things I say is, rather than think about perfection, focus on connection. And people who are
Yeah.
actually deep thinkers and take the time to think things through are really good at connecting. So connection is much more important than perfection in what we say.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because as a writer, I'm so there's a lot of time to
Yeah.
write the shitty first draft and then edit it and edit it and edit it. And for a long time, I was a little uncomfortable about doing something like this, like you and I are doing,
Yes.
or doing a podcast because I wasn't able to edit what I was saying. And I think the reason why this kind of format is so valuable for people is that people actually sometimes prefer the rough draft to the final
Yeah.
product. They like to watch how you're thinking and the talking in drafts. So I think that can be really, really helpful.
Absolutely. Conversation and discovery is really something that engages people. If I just come to you with the
Yeah.
polished solution, then I am presenting it to you rather than engaging you with it. So I love that idea of revealing your process as you're going through it. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And Robinson, who's listening in, says genuine listening and following up with nonverbal cues are crucial. Yes, and so, summarizing what other people have said is a way of giving them credit,
Yeah.
and of connecting with them.
Absolutely. So paraphrasing does several things. It validates the other person. It demonstrates you've listened. It validates that you heard things correctly, so you move things forward, and it gives you an opportunity, as was mentioned by a couple people in below, is that you actually can then add your commentary to it. But you have to listen differently when you're listening to summarize and paraphrase. Most of us listen just enough to get the gist of what somebody's saying, and then
Yeah.
we click into here. I'm going to formulate my response. I'm going to deliver it. You have to listen deeply. And that listening deeply serves to actually connect, build relationships, and increase accuracy of what you're hearing.
Yeah, and Bhuvana Swari, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, says paraphrasing not only helps to contribute, but also to put your own idea at the end without interrupting the flow. I think that is really, really, really important. And Josh is asking us, we often agonize about the right words when it's more about how we show up that folks are going to remember. The
Yes.
connection that Matt is talking about, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. It's a
Yes, that's
Maya
Maya
Angelou.
Angelou. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Uh,
yeah,
very true there. And when I encourage people to listen, I have a whole chapter in the book on listening, which people find ironic because it's about how do you communicate in the moment, and
yeah,
listening is important. Because we listen so fast, we miss subtle nuance that gets in the way. So imagine, Kim, you and I come out of a meeting, and you say, how do you think that went? And I immediately hear, oh, she wants feedback, and I start itemizing
yeah.
all the things that what could have been better, etc. But had I really listened, I would have noticed that you left through the back door, not the same door I did. You talked with a little less affect in your voice. You were looking down as you asked me the question. And perhaps what you were really asking for in that moment was support, not
Yes.
and by me criticizing all the things that we did wrong, that's actually working against me. So I have to listen in a different way, a more nuanced way. And I teach with a colleague. His name's Collins Dobbs. He's a lecturer at the business school, and he has this way of talking about crucial conversations. And I
Mhm.
borrowed his framework for listening with his permission, and it's pace, space, grace. We have to
Mhm.
slow ourselves down. We move so quickly and things come at us so fast. You have to slow down to listen well. You have to give yourself some space not just physical space, move to an environment where you can
Yeah.
actually listen, but also mental space. I have to clear my mind to really listen and focus, be present. And then grace is allow yourself not just to listen to what you're hearing, but also what are you seeing and what's that intuition that you're feeling as a result of what you're hearing. Give yourself permission and grace to respond in that way. So pace, space, grace, I think, are ways to listen, to connect, like we're talking about.
And does grace also mean sort of assuming good intent of others? I often say that when you're the listener, it's
Yeah,
really useful to assume good intent. But when you're the
absolutely.
talker, it's really, it can be, you can be weaponizing good intent if you demand that the other person assume good intent of you. And so I think that is helpful.
I absolutely agree. It's very helpful to assume good intent, even though what somebody is saying might feel harsh or might feel challenging. Another mindset shift I often talk about is turning these challenging situations into opportunities rather than threats. If
Yeah.
I say to you, "Hey, at the end of your presentation, you're going to get Q&A," most people don't go, "Oh, great, I'm so excited." Most people are, "Uh-oh, I have to defend my position. I'm going to get challenged." Yet if you see an opportunity in that to connect, to extend, to collaborate, it changes your whole demeanor. So having that good intent perception, like you just discussed, is really important.
Yeah. Kathy has a really good question. However, I struggle when a C level stops the conversation and asks me for an answer to a question that I don't know. I don't have the answer.
Yeah.
So what is your advice for
Right. So
Kathy?
so this is the second most frequently asked question I get.
Mhm.
The first one is, what do I do if I blank out? The second is, what do I do when I don't know the answer? So I believe you have to say, I don't know the answer. Making
Yeah.
something up, I think, only sets you up for failure.
Yes.
It is unrealistic for somebody to expect that you know all the answers. So here's how I would respond in that circumstance. I would say, I don't know the answer, but here's what I'm going to do to find the answer. And
Yeah.
I give a path and a time frame, and I'll get back to you by tomorrow. And then
Yeah.
if you have an inkling or a hunch, I would say that. I say, I don't know the answer, but I'm going to go talk to Kim. I'll get back to you in 24 hours. My hunch is the answer
Yeah.
will be along these lines. And I
Yeah.
think that's a very reasonable answer. Now, if you're doing that to every question, then we have a different issue. But
Yeah.
upon occasion, it's okay not to know everything.
Of course, of course. And I think sometimes the person may be asking a question that you can't possibly know the answer to as a form of bullying you.
Yeah,
And a good way to take the air out of that balloon is to say, I don't know, but I can find out, you know?
that's right.
Because if you allow yourself to get into the trap of, oh well, here's what, then believe me, they'll tell you you're wrong, and that's worse.
Well, absolutely. And I'm a big fan of clarifying questions too. When somebody asks you a question you don't know, I might come back and ask for some clarification because maybe I do know something about this. I just don't understand what they're really trying to figure out. So I think it's reasonable to come back and say, would love to answer your question. I'm curious though about this, this, and this. And maybe out of that, you get something you can respond to.
Yeah, yeah. And Kathy says sometimes they do expect you to have the answer, and sometimes that expectation is unreasonable.
Sure.
And I think it's perfectly fine not to challenge unreasonable expectations. I think there's also something that I want to talk. I want to talk about the bloviating BSer, but let's finish on the question before we get into
I love the
bloviating.
alliteration there too.
Me too. It's one of my favorite parts of just work. Okay. Sometimes even telling someone to take more ownership over deliverables or develop an executive presence. I have to say, every time I say those words, it's like nails on a chalkboard for me.
Yes.
With clients doesn't even feel super tangible because executive presence is, when I've been told that, what they're really telling is, gee, I wish you were a man. Anyway,
Oh.
but
Mm.
also I even have a problem of identifying the actual problem enough to get that far. I just assume it's a cost of working with that person. Do you have any tips for turning the something's just not quite right slash ready and the actionable feedback to help people make it to the next level? So this is a situation where this person's boss is telling them that someone who works for them
Yeah.
is not ready for promotion, and this person thinks it's not quite fair. Like, but how can they help this person get ready?
So I would hope in these circumstances that this is not a one and done conversation, that they've been talking consistently over time about what it takes to get to the next level. So this just becomes part of a broader, longer conversation than coming back and saying, "Hey, here are the things that just aren't fitting," because that's a
Yeah.
much different conversation.
Yeah.
I when it comes to giving feedback like this, I always see feedback, and you and I have talked about this before. It's an opportunity to problem solve. And so
Yes.
I wouldn't come back and just say, "Hey, you're not ready. Here are the three things you need to do." It's coming back and saying, to succeed in the next level up position, here are some of the skills, attributes, and traits. Let's talk about and think through where you stack up on these and what we can do to help prepare you for that. And it becomes a conversation that we're having, a problem together that we're solving, that has some direct actionable steps. And to me, that's a more productive conversation. That's a conversation that demonstrates concern and support. And then I would also, at the same time, if I believe this person is ready, I would be advocating and persuading up to also
Yeah.
try to make sure that things are aligned. So
Yeah.
I, as the person in that middle position, would be working both ends, both directions.
Yeah, that's the difficulty of being a middle manager. I was once in a situation where there was someone who worked for me, and he wanted a regional role, a global regional role, and it was an American company. The region was Asia, and this guy had a very strong accent, and it was so unjust. But I knew that the person who led the whole region would have a problem with his accent. And
Mm.
I mean, I was not going to give this guy the feedback that the
Right,
problem was his accent, because the problem was that the person leading the region didn't speak the language in the region. It was
you're right,
really unfair. It was an extreme example of this.
right.
And so I really had to work on the leader, not on the employee,
Yeah,
to
middle
be
management is
more fair.
really
It's
tough.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
really. I've
really,
been there
really.
too, and what I've learned is alliances are really
Mhm.
important. So it's not just you going into the battle or into the conversation, but having others help you,
Yeah.
and echo what you're saying can be helpful. But yes, it's challenging.
Yeah, yeah. So there was a question from Tanisha, who says, and people, please, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing names wrong. Um, but what is your answer to the first question? What do you do when you just blank out? Like, how do you handle that situation?
Yes. Okay. So yeah, I've got a lot to say about blanking out. So a few things. There are things you can do in advance to help reduce the likelihood that you will blank out. One, the fear of blanking out is the single biggest driver of actually blanking out. So we need to
Yes.
reduce our anxiety. And anxiety looms large in planned presenting and
Yeah.
spontaneous speaking. In this book and in other places, I have lots to say about how to manage anxiety. There are things you can do to feel more comfortable and confident in communication. So that's the first step, is
So
find
what,
ways to
like, what's
take the pressure.
one way to manage anxiety?
Uh, there are lots of ways. So we have to manage both symptoms and sources. Symptoms are what we physiologically experience, and then the
Hmm.
sources are the things that initiate and exacerbate. So let me give you one of each. Deep breathing, as simple as it sounds, is fundamentally important to managing the symptoms we feel.
Yeah.
A deep belly breath, like if you've ever done yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, where you really fill your lower abdomen, can really help. Make sure that your exhale is twice as long as your inhale. I learned this from Andrew Huberman, actually. I interviewed him on my
Hmm.
podcast, and I've been telling people to deep breathe for a long time. And he said, really, the research says it's the exhalation that's important. So that's one way to manage symptoms. A source of anxiety that many of us experience is we have a goal we're trying to achieve. And I actually advocate for having goals in communication. But many of us are made nervous that we're not going to achieve our goal. And if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm not going to get funding. If you're one of my students, I'm not going to get a good grade. If you're a manager, you're not going to get support. Those are the things that cause you the anxiety. Anxiety about the goal is really anxiety about a potential negative future outcome. So if you
Yeah.
can become more present oriented in the moment, by definition, you're not worried about the future. So how do you do that? Well, you do something physical. You engage
Yes.
in a conversation. You listen to a song or a playlist before you go into the meeting or log into the virtual
You do
session.
the pose, the
Yeah,
Wonder
you can
Woman
do you
pose.
can do the power pose. That's physical. You can I do something very simple. This sounds silly. I say tongue twisters. Before we started today, Kim, I will say a tongue twister to get me present oriented. It helps me focus in the moment and it warms up my voice. So There are things we can do to manage both symptoms and sources that help us feel better, and that will help reduce blanking out.
What tongue
Second,
twister? What tongue twister did you
well, I
say?
know you'll like this
You know, I
because
was going to ask.
you have a little flair. My favorite tongue twister is 3 phrases, takes 5 seconds, and if you say it wrong, you say a naughty word. So I'll share this.
Okay.
I did this 3 times before you and I connected today. I slit a sheet I slit, and on that slitted sheet I sit. And you can see what the naughty word might be. And so that helps me get present oriented, and it warms up my voice. You know, if you're an athlete, a musician, an actor, you will always warm up before you do your
Yeah.
things. Yet when it comes to speaking, we think we're going to go from silence to brilliance easily, and that's silly.
Yeah.
You need to warm up.
Yeah.
So in terms of blanking out, working on anxiety will help. Lowering your anxiety makes it less likely. Additionally, and I hope we can talk about this more in a bit, having a structure, a roadmap to your communication matters, both planned or spontaneous. Having a structure helps. It's hard to get lost if you have a map. So
Yeah.
these are things we can do in advance. In the moment, if you do actually blank out, the worst has happened and you blank out, 2 suggestions. One, go back to go forward. Just like if you lose your keys or your phone, you retrace your steps. For most of us, repeating what we just said will get us back on track. And we think, oh, repeating myself is bad. We repeat ourselves all the time. It's actually helpful. So don't worry about repeating yourself. And if that doesn't work, distract your audience. And what do I mean by that? Give your audience something to do so you can get yourself a moment to get yourself back on track. As a teacher, I do this all the time. I'll forget what I want to say and I'll stop and I'll say, let's pause for a moment. And I'd like each of you to think about how what we've just said could impact your next interaction. And my students aren't thinking, oh man,
Good.
Matt forgot. My students are thinking, wow, he really cares. I bet everybody listening into this can come up with a question that they could ask that would get their audience thinking about their content so that they can get themselves back on track. It could be as simple as, I want you to think about what we've just discussed and how it applies to the next topic. And that gets people thinking, gives you that 10, 15 seconds you need to get back on track. So to blank out, you have to do things in advance, reduce your anxiety, have a map that is a structure in mind, and then go back to go forward and distract your audience with a question.
Yeah, I love that. So, see, this is what I mean, practical tactical tips. You can all do these things.
Yes.
One of the things that a speech coach told me when I got feedback that I said too many
Yes.
was to force myself a couple of times in a presentation to pause for 6 seconds, to allow
Mhm.
6 seconds of silence. What do
Yes.
you think of that? That is hard. 6 seconds is an eternity.
Silence is really, really hard, but sometimes silence is the most important thing you can do in an interaction. I'm a big fan of improvisation. You mentioned Kelly Leonard; he's an expert at improv. Improv has this saying that I love. They have lots of sayings I love. It's don't just do something, stand there.
Yeah.
And really, that emphasizes this point that a lot happens in silence.
Yeah.
So I think one way you demonstrate power, and I know you and I both have difficult issues with
Authority,
that.
we can
Yeah,
say.
yeah,
Authority.
right. One way to do that is to be silent, right? And that establishes some of that. But it also gives you time to collect your thoughts. And while you're silent, your audience is doing work. Here's the time that is most difficult, I think people have being quiet. When you call for questions. Are there any questions on what I've just said? You have to give people a few moments to formulate their questions, to muster their courage, to figure out what they want to say. Yet we, sitting in that silence, feel incredibly awkward. So most people say, are there any questions? No, great, thank you. They leave no time. So I'm a fan of silence. I'm a fan of silence to collect your thoughts and to let others collect their thoughts.
I love that. And it's interesting. I noticed something yesterday. Usually, I do now most of my talks over Zoom or
Yeah.
a platform like this, a StreamYard. And yesterday, I actually went and did one in person, and it takes people a lot longer to ask questions when they're in person than on on the screen. I was like, oh my gosh, I got to count to 12. It felt like
It
forever.
does. It takes people, yeah, because there's a lot going on there.
Yeah. So Ksenia Scott has a question. How can we speak differently when a colleague or a C level is not actively listening. So what do you do? How do you talk when someone's not listening? What do you do?
So I think a taser, no, the way it's all about relevance, right? Senior leaders have a lot going on, and I'm not giving them excuses by any means, but they have a
Yeah.
lot going on, and so you have to make sure that it's relevant. And a lot of the time, we give a lot of superfluous information that's not required. My mother has this saying that I love. I know she didn't create it. I don't know who did, but her saying is, "Tell me the time, don't build me the clock." And a lot of us, when we talk to people, especially senior leaders, we do a lot of clock building. We give them all the background, and they need the bottom line up front. Here's what's relevant.
Yes.
Here's what's important. They can then ask you questions about the how you built the clock. So I think the key to getting people involved, regardless of if they're senior leaders or not, is make it relevant and salient to them. How do you do that? Well, you have to spend time understanding what's important to them.
Yeah.
A lot of us
Yeah.
think about what's important to us, but what's important to them, and then maybe using questions or using stories to get them engaged and interested will help as well.
You know, it's so interesting. When I worked at Google, I taught this class called Email Haiku, and that was basically the idea. Is like if it doesn't fit in, and we had like little blackberries. We didn't.
Yeah, yeah. You bet
If
you're dating yourself, but
Yes,
yes,
I'm dating myself. If it doesn't fit into the little screen,
yeah.
and by the way, remember your boss may be older and maybe is using big font in there. Uh, so a really little screen, increase the size of your font. Then they're not gonna read it. And I adopted the same sort of approach to in-person communication. I try to always be extremely succinct. And then
Yes.
when I got to Apple, my boss told me that I had gotten so brief that it felt rude to him.
Oh,
And so it
interesting.
was
Yeah.
very, yeah. So it's important to
Well,
like
what
pay
a gift.
attention.
Yeah, what a gift that boss gave you, is to say, "Hey, now you can add a little color
Yeah,
commentary to it." Yeah.
yeah,
So,
you can tell some stories, humanize yourself a little
yeah,
bit.
yeah. Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So should we talk about the bloviating BSer?
Yes, I just like saying bloviating BSer.
I
What
know,
is
me
it? What
too.
would you
That's
like to
really
talk about that? I have been accused occasionally by my teenagers of
no.
being a bloviator BSer.
No, well, the only people in your life who really wanna give you feedback are your teenagers, and they're right about a lot of things, but they're definitely not right about everything.
They could work on their delivery too.
Yes, yes, exactly. So anyway, here is what happens often on a team,
Yes.
speaking of not listening. There will be a couple of people on every team who tend to hog all the airtime on the team. They talk, if there's 5 people in a meeting, they talk 60% of the time. And then other people not, and there's so much evidence that shows when everyone on a team talks roughly the same amount, the team does better. So the bloviating BSer really hurts the team's ability to do well. And invariably, the bloviating BSer is someone who is from a power dominant group. There, there
Mhm.
was there was a great article in the Washington Post, I believe, a few years ago. They did this study where they asked people if how what their level of expertise was on one of 5 different math topics. And one of the math topics was not a topic. It was just made up. It sounded like it might be
Right.
an area of math, but it was completely made up. And rich people were much more likely to say they knew all about that topic than people who were not rich. White people were more likely to know all about that topic than people who were not white, and men were more likely to know all about that topic than people who are not men. So the tendency to BS and to pretend that we know what we don't know goes up the more power that we have, and there I do mean power. Uh,
Right. Right.
and this is why I'm ambivalent about power. So how can you make sure that when you're thinking faster and talking smarter, you're not falling prey to the tendency to be the bloviating BSer? And how, if you have someone on your team who is uh, bullshitting in a bloviating way,
Mhm.
how can you get a word in edgewise?
Yes. So the whole point of think faster, talk smarter is, in the moment, be concise and clear. So
Hmm.
it's built into the methodology to be focused. In fact, I have a chapter called the F word of communication, and it's not the naughty one I know you thought of, Kim. It's focus, be
Yes.
focused. And
Yeah.
in the way we communicate today, concision is critical. You have to be concise, you have to be clear. And so the methodology in and of itself is devised to avoid the bloviating, to
Yeah.
avoid leveraging, if you do have access to the power that you talked about, to avoid leaning into that. In fact, listening is better. So for example, how do you do that? Well, a couple things. Have a clear goal to what you're saying. We talked about goals a little earlier. To me, a goal has three parts: information, emotion, and action. What is it you want to get across? That's the information. How do you want people to feel about it? And what do you want them to do? If you think that way as you're speaking in a planned or spontaneous situation, it helps focus your message. Many times when we're speaking spontaneously, we're discovering what we want to say as we're saying it, and we take people on that journey, and that can take a long time. That's like working against concision. So be focused, be concise, have a clear goal, prioritize what you're saying. Now, if you were in a conversation where somebody is bloviating and BSing,
Yeah.
you need to shut them down. So a couple things. One, have ground rules before you go into these circumstances where everybody's voice is valued. We want to hear everybody. That gives you some air cover to call out people. So you could say,
Yeah.
I'm hearing a lot from you, Kim. I'd love to hear from some other folks. Another way to do it is to shut them down. And how do you insert yourself? One, again, I sound like a broken record. Paraphrasing is the most polite way I know to shut somebody up. If they're bloviating, highlight something of value they've said, name
Hmm.
it, and then move on. So I could say, hey, Kim, that point about the implementation plan, really important. I'm curious, what do others think? Or the
Yes.
next step of our agenda mentions that. So I validate something you've said, and then I move forward. Now, that can feel awkward when the person has higher status, higher power. But
Yeah.
remember, your credibility is being judged not only by what you do, but what you don't do. So the rest of the group might be, my kids play way too many video games. They have life points above their
Yeah.
characters' heads.
Yeah.
You have a credibility points above your head. And if you're not
Yeah.
interceding in a circumstance where somebody is taking too much airtime, your credibility points in view of everybody else are going down. So we need to use paraphrasing. You can ask a question of other people. You could say, hey, that's a really important point about the implementation plan. How many of the rest of you have that in your view? So that way of interrupting, I think, is the most polite way, and it brings you back to focus.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is such helpful advice. I once worked with a professor who said that when there was one person dominating a room, this is when I was teaching managing at Apple, and Richard Tedlow, who's a colleague of mine, said, One thing you can do is you can actually walk closer to them.
Yes. Oh yeah.
That and your instinct is to walk away, but if you walk closer, they tend
So
to pipe
Let,
down.
let me double
Yeah,
down on that, Kim. So when I left high tech, and I worked in high tech for over a decade, I taught high school for 2 years before I graduated to now at Stanford GSB. But you learn a lot about life as a high school
yeah,
teacher.
yeah,
And one of the
I'm
things you
sure.
learn to manage a classroom is you approach the challenge, right? So if
Yeah,
students are talking or they're not, because we've learned, most of us respond when the voice gets louder and closer, we stop, right?
yeah, yeah,
Now, virtually, it's a little harder to do. And that's where you can leverage private chats and other things where you could say, hey, I really like what you're saying here, but let's make sure other people have some room to contribute. And so there are ways to do it non-verbally
yeah.
isn't so public that can be helpful to you.
Yeah, there's also tools, I think, if it's a virtual situation, there are tools that actually measure everyone's airtime. And then
There are absolutely. There's a great tool I like, and it's a tool called poised.com, and it plugs into Zoom and other things where it'll actually tell you your talk time, it'll tell you your vocal intensity, filler words, and it's very useful because it's
yeah,
hard to keep track of how much time you're speaking because you're so involved in what you're doing.
yeah, yeah. There's another book called STFU, which has
Yes,
lots of advice
Dan
about
Lyons is
what.
great.
Yeah, I
Yes,
love
yes.
Dan Lyons.
I interviewed him on Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast I do, which you will be a guest on very soon. Thank you. And he talks about some wonderful ways to, one, self recognize that you talk too much, and
Yeah,
then two, what to do to get yourself to be quiet.
yeah. So Robinson says, I took an improv class
Wow.
once, and the phrase yes and has been huge in my communication. It was scary to sign up for improv, but I'm glad I did. Anyone thinking about it, just do it. You'll be glad you did. So I wonder if there's an improv class that
Ye-
you recommend folks take.
So first, thank you for saying that. Improvisation is so powerful in helping people become better communicators, and I would argue better people. I
Yes.
rely a lot on wisdom from improvisation. I have some mentors in improv: Adam Tobin, Dan Klein. These are folks who are amazing. There's a great book, a great place to start, by Patricia Ryan Madsen. It's called Improv Wisdom. Short little book,
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally changed my life. The way I approach things, amazing. Look for improv classes around your area. Now, being affiliated with Stanford's continuing studies program offers classes in improv. You can take them from anywhere around the world if they fit into your time. I highly recommend it. Improv is not about being funny.
Yeah.
Improv is about thinking fast on your feet, respecting others, and really learning how to be present oriented. It is an incredibly valuable skill.
Yeah. In fact, we developed a sort of a radical candor sitcom with Second City based
Oh,
on
I
improv.
love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's called The Feedback Loop. So if you want to see where radical candor meets improv, you can check out The Feedback Loop on the Radical Candor website.
Oh,
I
I'm definitely
love
checking that
it.
out.
It was really fun to do. Um, so a lot of people are excited about poised.com. So
Oh, good.
that's
Yeah, yeah. No,
when
and there are other tools
people.
like that, but it's a great tool. It can really help you. Make sure you put the D on it. I'm going to tell you a funny story, Kim.
Okay.
I mentioned this to a coaching client because I do some coaching. And I said, you should use this tool. It's really going to help you be more comfortable and confident speaking. If you don't put the D in poised, it goes to poised.com, which is adult diapers. And so he wrote back and
Okay.
said, this is how you want me to be
This
more
is
comfortable speaking. So it got me in hot water with a client. So you got to be
that is
careful with that
really
one.
funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's good. So Vera says, I love that interrupting is okay and even necessary. I have been interrupted with people my whole career. So let's talk about interrupting, because I think that it is an often misunderstood topic.
Right. So there's obviously doing the interruption. We talked a little bit about that, how to get people back on track, how to move things forward. I think paraphrasing and questioning are good ways to do it. Being interrupted can be challenging and hard, and
Yeah.
and many people get interrupted for lots of reasons, some of which it just pains me. When you are interrupted, it is important, I believe, to make sure that the interrupter knows that it's not appropriate. Now, how and when you do that, I think is up to you. You have to make that call, but you need to assert your position and your point of view. And if somebody is jumping on that, reclaiming it is important. And again, I think you can do it politely with paraphrasing. If somebody interrupts, you can say, yeah, that point, right, but let's get back to the point I was making. So being active in it, and I certainly don't mean to be blaming the victim here by any means, but we need to make sure our voices are heard, and we have to assert those voices. And if somebody's trying to take the space away from us to do that, we need to claim that space back. And you can do it by paraphrasing. You can do it by asking questions. You can do it by saying, hey, I wasn't done. I need to finish my thought.
Yeah.
And it's important to do.
Yeah. I think that is really great advice. I also think that I was working with one team, and they had become so paranoid about not interrupting each other that they were no longer having conversations.
Yeah.
They were having, it was like always going around the room. And so I think we want to make sure that we don't get so worried about not into, like I was on a podcast with a man, and he was so afraid of like being accused of mansplaining or something that he wouldn't challenge me, and he wouldn't, I had to like wait a long time. So I think we like need to get a little looser about I think we it is a it's complicated, as everything is.
Yeah, it
It's
is
complicated.
complicated for sure. I would say look for patterns. If you're interrupted once in the midst of a flow of a dialogue and conversation, I think that's different than somebody who's constantly interrupting you or constantly interrupting others. And I think you treat it differently. But
Yeah.
creativity, collaboration involves engaged conversation, and some of
Yeah.
that conversation will step on top of other people. I do think we need to have those who are responsible for facilitation or leading manage some of that, to look at it, because it's hard for us to look at the bigger picture when we're so engaged. And it's helpful for somebody to say, hey, I'm really hearing from this side of the room. I'd love to hear from over there a little bit,
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
bring those voices out. The subtle orchestra conducting that all of us can do in conversation, I think, is really important.
Yeah. And sometimes if the person is a bloviating BSer, you have to interrupt.
Oh, absolutely.
Or
Yeah, no,
them.
interrupting is a tool. It is a
Yeah.
tool.
Yeah. Yeah. So Phil has a good question. Isn't it, and there's two questions Phil has. One is, isn't it inefficient if a meeting with 6 people and it spends most of the time with all of them paraphrasing one another? So I don't think that's what you're recommending, but it's a
Yeah.
good question.
Yeah, obviously, paraphrasing is one of many tools, and you don't need to paraphrase everything. It is just a tool that is utilized and many people aren't comfortable using. That's why I'm emphasizing it so much.
Yeah, yeah. And another question from Phil is, there's a saying that in business, an employee will never be honest until they have nothing to lose. How can you be radically candid when in most cases the environment isn't safe? And I think that my answer to that is always start with soliciting feedback and then rewarding the candor when you get it. You've got to prove to people that it is safe, especially if you're a leader, because a lot of people have been in cases where it wasn't safe to speak up. And so, especially if you're a leader, you need to make it safe to speak up.
Amen. Amen. I agree completely with that.
So I think we got just another couple of minutes. There's a good question. Is there any advice for non-English native speakers? This
Yes.
is important.
Oh, it is so important. So important. We are in a global world where multiple languages are spoken. Not everybody is speaking in their native language. I am in awe of my students, the people I coach and teach who are non-native speakers. I struggle with my native language often. So a few things I'll share. One, this is such an important topic to me that we started on my podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart. With every episode now, we are releasing English language learning content where we take a noun, a verb, a modifier, and an idiom that is mentioned in the podcast and post it for people to actually get better at language. So one is we all have to work to improve. Second, we have to really, as communicators who are speaking in a native language, we need to make sure that we reduce jargon, that we reduce acronyms, that we help everybody, not just non-native speakers, understand us by language choice. But I also think what's really important is, as communicators, both as non-native speakers and native speakers of the language, make your point and then support them, repeat yourself essentially by using a different example. So I might make a point and then tell a story. Kim is great at this. She makes a point and then she gives you an example. And if you didn't understand the point, you understand it through the example. So it's a form of repetition that actually helps clarify what's being said. And that's helpful regardless of if you're speaking the same language or not. So it's really important for all of us to help with fidelity, to help with understanding, to make our points and support them with story, anecdotes, analogies, testimonials. Those are all ways of reinforcing your point.
And I think I like to use jargon and colorful language, and sometimes that can be hard for people. Like bloviating BS is a perfect example of that. A lot of people, even people who are native English speakers, probably don't know.
Bloviate isn't a common word.
Yeah, bloviate is not a common word. I love it because it sounds kind of onomatopoetic.
Yes, exactly.
So
But
basically,
Kim, when you use that term, and I'm interrupting you
Mhm.
here, but Kim, when you use that term, you made very clear what you were talking about. So even if I didn't understand what a bloviating BSer is, it was clear to me it was somebody, and I think you literally said somebody who takes all the air in the room.
Yeah.
Right. So you defined it for us, and that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And I think creating a situation where it's safe for people to interrupt and say, I don't know what that means. Like the more we can do to make it safe to say, I don't know, and to encourage everyone. Like, I think that phrase, I don't know, is, I think, one of the most valuable phrases in any language, in English or in any other. Ya nie znаю, I don't know.
Right.
Je ne sais pas. Like in every language, we need to
Wow, you
know
are
how
so
to say.
multilingual. I couldn't give examples, but I think you're right. I think and what's embedded in I don't know is I want to know. right? So it
Yes.
invites this connection. It invites this way of us working together and collaborating. So I think that is so important to learn to feel comfortable with that. It's okay not to know everything. That's how you learn. That's how you grow. That's how things change.
Yes, yes. Well, I want to let Tanisha have the last word here. She says, I think that's where grace comes in and helping folks to understand that the environment is open. You want them to be heard and that challenging is okay. And also making mistakes is okay. I'm adding something to what you said. We have to be open to the fact that we might not say the perfect thing and that others won't either. Assuming good intent also helps. Yes, I think that's the perfect note to end on. One of the things that I advise people is to make all hour-long meetings 50 minutes. So we're now 2 minutes over so that we have time to get on the phone and talk to each other afterwards, or maybe go to the bathroom or get a drink of water, but take care of ourselves. All right. So Matt, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Thanks for the engagement. And get a copy of Matt's book. When does it come out, Matt?
It comes out end of September, September 26th. Kim, it was a true pleasure to speak with you. People might not know this, but Kim and I are actually neighbors. We go on walks together and have these types of conversations. It was wonderful to invite others in. And on my Think Fast, Talk Smart podcast on September 5th, you get to hear Kim answer the questions, not ask them.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. This was great.
Thank you.